Today's mystery involves three enslaved women, a tobacco heir, and a public ceremony so controversial that for over a century descendants refused to speak of what they witnessed. 400 souls stood in a Virginia town square in 1847 and watched something that defied every law and custom of the time. The marriage certificates, plural, remain sealed in a private family vault to this day, their contents known only to a handful of historians who have sworn never to reveal the full details. I'm your host, and this is Whispers of Mystery, where we uncover the buried truths of history that were deliberately excluded from the record. Before we descend into this particular darkness, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit that notification bell. These stories don't appear in textbooks for a reason, and we're committed to bringing them to light. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? What hidden stories from your region should we investigate next? What I'm about to share with you has been pieced together from private letters that were never meant to be published, from plantation records that were deliberately excluded from public archives, from sworn testimonies that vanished into family vaults. This is the story of how one man's attempt to control his legacy created a scandal that nearly tore an entire county apart. It begins on a scorching July afternoon in 1847 in rural Chesterfield County, Virginia, when a plantation owner named Abraham Sutherland walked into his weathered tobacco barn and discovered something that would force an entire community to confront the darkest contradictions of their society. Chesterfield County sat at the heart of Virginia's tobacco empire in those years. Picture endless fields of bright-leaf tobacco stretching along the Appomattox River, the soil still yielding what planters called gold. The Sutherland estate, known locally as Hollow Crest, sprawled across 800 acres of prime bottomland, worked by 42 enslaved people whose labor had built the family's fortune over 3 generations. The main house stood on a gentle rise overlooking those fields, a Federal-style manor with 4 white columns that gleamed in the Virginia sun. Behind it, a cluster of outbuildings formed their own small village. The kitchen house, the smokehouse, the dairy, and at the farthest edge of the compound, a massive tobacco barn with walls weathered to the color of old pewter. Abraham Sutherland was 58 years old that summer, a man whose rigid posture and precisely trimmed grey beard reflected his view of the world as something that could and should be ordered according to strict principles. He'd inherited Hollow Crest from his father and expanded it methodically, purchasing adjacent properties and additional slaves with the calculated precision of someone playing chess. His wife Catherine had died 6 years earlier of consumption, leaving him with their only child, a son named Thomas, who'd always seemed too gentle for the world Abraham was preparing him to inherit. Thomas Sutherland had turned 23 that spring. Tall and lean, with his mother's dark eyes and a quiet manner that his father often mistook for weakness. He'd been educated at a private academy in Richmond, studying agriculture and business as Abraham intended. But he'd returned to Hollow Crest 2 years earlier with what his father called impractical notions about modernizing their operations. They argued frequently about crop rotation, about purchasing new equipment, about the efficiency of their labor management. Abraham saw these disagreements as growing pains. His son would eventually understand that the old ways worked because they were right. What Abraham didn't know was that Thomas had stopped sleeping in the main house 18 months earlier. The arrangement had begun innocuously enough. Thomas had convinced his father that he needed to supervise the tobacco curing more closely, that the delicate process of transforming green leaves into marketable product required constant attention during the critical weeks of late summer. He'd moved a cot into the small office attached to the curing barn, insisting he needed to monitor temperature and humidity through the night. Abraham had approved this show of dedication. He'd even bragged to neighbouring planters that his son was finally showing proper commitment to the family business, but Thomas hadn't been monitoring tobacco. In the main section of that barn, behind stacks of wooden hogsheads and hanging bundles of leaf, Thomas had created something that would have been incomprehensible to his father. He'd created a home. He'd partitioned off a section with salvaged lumber, installed a small stove for cooking and heat, brought in proper furniture piece by piece under cover of darkness, and he'd been living there with 3 women who officially belonged to his father. Sarah, 25 years old, who'd worked in the main house as a seamstress, Rebecca, 22, assigned to the dairy, and Mary, just 20, who'd been trained as a cook. By the summer of 1847, Sarah had given birth to a 2-year-old boy. Rebecca was nursing an infant daughter, and Mary was 6 months pregnant. The women hadn't been stolen away or hidden by force. Each had come to that barn willingly, drawn by Thomas's quiet promises of something different, something better. He'd taught them to read using his mother's old books. He'd convinced the plantation's overseer, a man named Dutch H. Ricks, who owed Thomas a significant gambling debt, to alter the work schedules so the women could spend nights away from the slave quarters without raising immediate suspicion. Thomas had even been setting aside money, keeping detailed records in a leather journal of every dollar he saved, planning for some distant future when he might buy their freedom and escape Virginia entirely. It was a fantasy, of course, built on the unstable foundation of youth and desperation, and like all such fantasies in the antebellum South, it was destined to collapse. The discovery happened on July 14th, a Wednesday afternoon when the temperature had climbed past 95 degrees and the air hung thick enough to cut. Abraham had been inspecting the tobacco fields, walking the rows with his overseer to assess the crop's readiness for harvest. They'd been discussing labor allocation for the coming weeks when Abraham noticed something that struck him as odd. Dutch H. Ricks seemed nervous, kept steering the conversation away from questions about night supervision of the curing process. Abraham had built his fortune on attention to detail, on noticing the small discrepancies that revealed larger problems. He dismissed H. Ricks and walked alone toward the curing barn, his boots raising small clouds of dust from the parched earth. The barn's main doors stood partially open to catch any hint of breeze. Abraham had been expecting to find Thomas reviewing the previous year's curing records, preparing for the imminent harvest. Instead, he heard children laughing. The sound stopped him completely. There shouldn't be children anywhere near the curing barn. It was strictly off limits to everyone except Thomas and the senior workers. Abraham moved quietly toward the sound, which seemed to be coming from deeper within the barn's shadowy interior. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, he saw the makeshift partition wall, saw the gap where Thomas had hung a curtain made from old flour sacks. What Abraham witnessed when he pulled that curtain aside would be described in his private letters with language that veered between rage and something approaching horror. Thomas sat at a rough wooden table with Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary, all of them eating from actual plates. Not the tin dishes allocated to enslaved people, but ceramic plates from the main house. The 2-year-old boy was playing on the floor with carved wooden toys. The infant nursed at Rebecca's breast. On the wall, someone had hung a calendar where dates were marked with careful X's, as though this hidden family was tracking time like any normal household. Abraham's first word, according to Thomas's later testimony, was not an angry shout, but a whispered question. How long? Thomas stood slowly, placing himself between his father and the women. 18 months, he said, and I won't apologize for it. What followed wasn't the violent confrontation one might expect. Abraham Sutherland didn't strike his son or immediately summon the overseer. Instead, he did something that Thomas later described as far more terrifying. He went completely still, his face draining of colour as he looked from his son to the women to the children and back again. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the flat effect of someone calculating the scope of a disaster. "You've been breeding them like this was your property to manage." Thomas tried to explain about his feelings for the women, about his plans to eventually free them, about how the situation was more complex than his father could understand, but Abraham wasn't listening. His mind was already working through the implications, seeing not a human drama but a tangle of legal and social problems that threatened to destroy everything he'd built. The enslaved women belonged to him, not Thomas. Any children born to them were his property as well, assets on his plantation's ledger. But Thomas had been acting as their husband, a relationship that had no legal standing but would be recognized by everyone in the county as a moral fact. If word of this spread, Abraham would become a laughingstock, the old fool who couldn't control his own son or his own property. Worse, there would be questions about what other irregularities existed at Hollow Crest, questions that might attract unwanted attention from neighbors, from business associates, from the careful social networks that maintained power in Antebellum, Virginia. "Stay here," Abraham finally said. "All of you, don't leave this barn, don't speak to anyone. I need to think." He walked back to the main house in the blazing afternoon heat, his mind racing. In his study, he pulled out the plantation's record books, reviewing the entries for Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary. Each was listed with her age, her skills, her approximate value. Beside Rebecca's name, someone, probably Thomas, had added a small notation in different ink. "Dairy work, excellent productivity." Abraham stared at those words, recognizing his son's handwriting, realizing that Thomas had been slowly inserting these women into the official records as valuable workers, probably planning to eventually request their purchase or transfer. The audacity of it was almost impressive. Almost. Abraham sat at his desk until well after dark, occasionally making notes on a sheet of paper, crossing out ideas, writing new ones. The house slaves reported later that he didn't call for dinner, didn't light more than a single candle. They heard him talking to himself once, a short burst of words none of them could make out clearly. By morning, Abraham Sutherland had made his decision. It would be a decision that shocked everyone who learned of it, a decision that would be argued about in Chesterfield County for generations. But in Abraham's calculation, it was the only solution that gave him any chance of controlling the scandal, of turning a disaster into something he could survive. He would make his son marry all three women publicly in the town square, where everyone could witness it. If you're feeling the weight of this story already, if you're starting to understand just how deeply disturbing this gets, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates dark history told honestly. And stay with me, because what happens next in that Virginia town square will challenge everything you thought you knew about how far people would go to maintain control. The announcement came at breakfast the following morning, delivered to Thomas in the main house's dining room with the same tone Abraham used to discuss crop yields or equipment purchases. "You will marry them," Abraham said, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. "All three. The ceremony will be Saturday at noon in the courthouse square. I've already sent word to Reverend Talbot." Thomas stared at his father, certain he'd misheard. "That's impossible. Virginia law doesn't recognize." "I'm aware of what Virginia law recognizes," Abraham interrupted. "The marriages won't be legally binding, but they will be public. Every planter in the county will witness my son taking responsibility for his actions, standing before God and community to declare these women as his wives. It's the only way to control what people will say, the only way to establish that this wasn't mere exploitation." The calculation behind Abraham's plan was both brilliant and deeply cynical. By forcing a public ceremony, he would preempt the worst gossip, establishing a narrative of irregular but acknowledged commitment rather than casual abuse. The story would become about his son's strange idealism, his foolish notions about enslaved women, troubling, yes, but contained within the framework of a young man's errors. More importantly, by making the marriages public but legally void, Abraham maintained actual ownership of the women and children. They would remain his property, assets he could manage, sell, or dispose of as he saw fit. Thomas's protests were immediate and vehement. The ceremony would humiliate the women, would reduce their relationship to a public spectacle, but Abraham had anticipated every objection. You wanted them acknowledged, he said coldly. You wanted their children to have standing. This gives them that, or as close as they'll ever get in Virginia. The alternative is I sell all three tomorrow morning to a cotton trader heading for Mississippi, and you never see them or those children again. Your choice. It wasn't a choice at all. And both men knew it. The next 3 days passed in a strange, suspended atmosphere at Hollow Crest. Abraham had Ricks moved Thomas and the women into one of the guest rooms in the main house, a tactical decision that kept them under observation, while also beginning the process of legitimizing their presence. Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary walked through the house's public spaces in a kind of daze, wearing clothes that had been pulled from storage, sitting at the dining table for meals while other enslaved people served them. The cognitive dissonance was profound and deliberate. They were being treated as family members while remaining chattel, elevated and degraded in the same breath. Abraham spent those days visiting neighboring plantations, personally delivering invitations to the Saturday ceremony. His approach was carefully calibrated. He presented the wedding as an eccentricity, an indulgence of his son's peculiar sensibilities that nevertheless demonstrated Thomas's willingness to take responsibility. The boy's got notions, Abraham would say, shaking his head with practiced resignation, but at least he's standing up before God and community. How many young men can say that these days? The response is varied. Some planters laughed, seeing the whole thing as an elaborate joke at Thomas's expense. Others were more disturbed, sensing implications they couldn't quite articulate. A few refused the invitation outright, considering the entire spectacle beneath their dignity. But Abraham had predicted that most would attend out of sheer curiosity, and he was right. By Friday evening, it was clear that Courthouse Square would be packed. In town, Reverend Marcus Talbot struggled with his own crisis of conscience. The 52-year-old minister had served Chesterfield County's Episcopal congregation for nearly 2 decades, presiding over countless weddings that reinforced the social order of Plantation, Virginia. What Abraham Sutherland was asking him to do existed in a grey area that made him deeply uncomfortable. The ceremonies wouldn't be legally binding, he'd been assured of that, but they would carry spiritual weight, his participation lending the proceedings a religious legitimacy that felt dangerous. Talbot met with Abraham twice during those 3 days, trying to find some way to refuse without directly challenging a man who contributed substantially to the church's finances. Abraham was prepared for this too, framing the issue in terms the Reverend couldn't easily dismiss. Weren't these women's souls worth saving? Wasn't it better to bring them into the Christian covenant through marriage, even irregular marriage, than to leave them in sin? And wasn't Thomas showing more moral courage than most young men of his class by publicly acknowledging his responsibilities? The arguments were specious, of course, twisting theology to serve Abraham's pragmatic ends, but they gave Talbot enough cover to agree. He would perform the ceremonies, he decided, because the alternative, leaving these women and children completely outside any social or spiritual recognition, seemed worse. On Friday night, Thomas sat with Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary in the guest room, trying to explain what would happen the next day. They'd all agreed to go through with it, not because they believed it would change their status in any meaningful way, but because the alternative Abraham had threatened was unbearable. Still, the reality of standing in the town square, of being displayed before the county's white population, filled them with a dread that went beyond ordinary fear. "We'll leave Virginia after this," Thomas promised, though he had no clear plan for how. "I'll find a way. Maybe Ohio, maybe Pennsylvania. Somewhere you'll be free." Mary, the youngest, touched her swollen belly. "And we'll be married, really married, where it matters." Thomas nodded, believing it himself, even though every practical consideration argued against it. The fantasy was all he had left to offer. Saturday morning arrived with the sky like beaten brass, the sun already punishing by 8 o'clock. Abraham rose early, dressing in his finest black suit, checking his appearance in the mirror with the same attention he'd give before a business negotiation. Because that's what this was, really, a negotiation with his community, an attempt to dictate the terms of his family scandal before it could dictate its own terms. At Hollow Crest, the house slaves had been instructed to prepare the women for the ceremony. They helped Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary into dresses that had belonged to Thomas's mother-white cotton gowns that had been hastily altered to fit. The symbolism was heavy-handed but deliberate. Abraham wanted the visual language of traditional weddings, wanted to anchor this irregular spectacle in recognizable forms. The women stood before a mirror together, looking at their reflections, seeing themselves transformed into brides in a mockery that somehow felt more cruel than any direct violence. Thomas wore a dark suit and held himself with a rigid formality that masked his terror. He'd barely slept, had spent the night alternating between anger at his father and fear for the women he'd dragged into this situation. As they prepared to leave for town, he pulled Sarah aside. "If you want to run," he whispered, "I won't blame you, any of you. I can create a distraction." Sarah cut him off, her voice low and certain. "We're going. We're standing up there with you because maybe this crazy thing your father's doing actually means something. Maybe people will see us and have to think about what we are, who we are. Maybe that's worth more than hiding." It was either profound courage or profound delusion. Thomas couldn't tell which. The wagon ride into town took 40 minutes. Abraham sat up front with Thomas, the 3 women and 2 children in the back, with a house slave named Peter who'd been instructed to keep watch. They passed other plantations, past enslaved people working in fields who stopped to stare at the strange procession. Word had spread, of course it had, and people were already speculating about what would happen in Courthouse Square. As they approached the town, Thomas could see that the square was already filling with spectators. Courthouse Square sat at the heart of Chesterfield, dominated by a red brick courthouse with a small bell tower. A raised platform stood before the courthouse steps, typically used for auctions and public notices. That's where the ceremony would take place, elevated so everyone could witness it clearly. Abraham had thought of everything. Even the choice of location carried meaning. This wasn't a church wedding, sacred and private, but a civic event, public and enforceable by community judgment, if not by law. The wagon rolled to a stop at the square's edge. Abraham climbed down first, then turned to help the women descend, playing the role of solicitous father-in-law with practiced ease. Thomas followed, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he took Sarah's arm, then Rebecca's, then Mary's. They stood together at the platform's base, and Thomas could feel hundreds of eyes on them, could hear the murmur of the crowd like distant thunder. Reverend Talbot stood on the platform in his ceremonial robes, a Bible open in his hands, his expression carefully neutral. Behind him, 3 county officials had gathered, the clerk, the sheriff, and the magistrate, not as participants, but as witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. Their presence gave the event an official weight that transcended mere spectacle. Abraham led the group up the platform steps, positioning them with the same attention he'd give to arranging furniture. Thomas stood in the center with Sarah on his right, Rebecca and Mary to his left. The children, too. Yeah, Old Samuel and 6-month-old Grace were held by Peter, who stood at the platform's far edge, visible but separate. Abraham took his own position slightly behind and to the side, a patriarch overseeing his family's strange ritual. The crowd pressed closer, perhaps 400 people packed into the square. Thomas recognized neighboring planters and their families, town merchants, craftsmen, and in the back, beyond the white spectators, a large group of enslaved people who'd been given permission to witness the ceremony. Their presence was crucial to Abraham's plan. This needed to be seen by everyone, needed to become a story that would be told and retold in precisely the way Abraham controlled. Reverend Talbot cleared his throat, and the crowd's murmur faded to expectant silence. "We are gathered here," he began, his voice carrying across the square, "in the sight of God and this community to witness an unusual covenant. Thomas Sutherland has come before us to declare his commitment to these 3 women, to acknowledge them before heaven and earth." The Reverend was walking a careful line, using the language of marriage without explicitly calling it that, invoking spiritual authority while avoiding legal specifics. He continued with a brief sermon about responsibility, about the duties men owe to those under their protection, about Christ's teachings regarding the least among us. It was theologically sound enough to provide cover while remaining vague enough to mean almost anything. Then came the vows themselves, and here the ceremony veered into territory that made even the most sympathetic spectators uncomfortable. Thomas Sutherland. Talbot intoned, "Do you take Sarah as your wife, to care for her in sickness and health, to provide for her wants, to acknowledge before God and community your bond with her?" Thomas's voice cracked slightly. "I do. Do you take Rebecca as your wife, to care for her in sickness and health, to provide for her wants, to acknowledge before God and community your bond with her?" "I do. Do you take Mary as your wife, to care for her in sickness and health, to provide for her wants, to acknowledge before God and community your bond with her?" "I do." The Reverend turned to each woman in sequence, asking if they accepted Thomas as their husband, if they entered this covenant willingly. Each answered yes, their voices steady despite the hundreds of staring eyes. Sarah's yes carried defiance, Rebecca's carried resignation, Mary's carried something that might have been hope. When the vows were complete, Talbot closed his Bible and raised his hands. "Before God and this community, I declare these bonds acknowledged. May the Lord have mercy on all involved." It wasn't "you may kiss the bride," it wasn't "I now pronounce you man and wife." The language was deliberately ambiguous, recognizing something without quite naming it, and yet, legally void though they were, those vows had been witnessed by 400 people. They existed now as social fact, undeniable and permanent. Abraham stepped forward with 4 documents he'd had prepared, marriage certificates drafted by a lawyer from Richmond, carefully worded to acknowledge the ceremony without claiming legal status. The county clerk had been instructed to sign as witness, creating a paper trail that existed in official records without constituting actual marriage licenses. It was a bureaucratic magic trick, giving the appearance of legitimacy while remaining legally void. As the clerk signed each document, a voice rang out from the crowd. "This is an abomination." Heads turned. The speaker was Harrison Caldwell, owner of an adjacent plantation and one of Abraham's longtime business rivals. Caldwell pushed through the crowd toward the platform, his face flushed with rage. "You've made a mockery of marriage, Sutherland. These creatures are property, not wives. You've degraded your family name, degraded all of us by forcing us to witness this travesty." Abraham had been expecting opposition, but Caldwell's timing was unfortunate. Before Abraham could respond, another voice joined the argument, this one from Joseph Brennan, a younger planter known for his religious fervor. "Actually," Brennan called out, his voice carrying unexpected authority, "what we've witnessed is a man taking responsibility. How many here can say their sons haven't taken advantage of enslaved women? At least Thomas Sutherland stands before us honestly. The crowd erupted into argument. Some men shouted agreement with Caldwell, calling the ceremony a disgrace. Others, perhaps uncomfortable with the implications for their own households, defended Abraham's approach as practical. Women in the crowd whispered urgently to each other, their faces reflecting a complex mix of scandal, sympathy, and vicarious horror. On the platform, Thomas felt Sarah's hand grip his arm. He looked at her and saw tears streaming down her face, not from fear or shame, but from something else entirely. Later, she would tell him that in that moment, listening to white men argue about her humanity, she felt herself become real in a way she never had before. The ceremony might be legally void, but it had forced everyone present to confront the cognitive dissonance at the heart of their society. Abraham raised his hands, calling for silence. When the crowd finally quieted, he spoke with the commanding presence of a man used to being obeyed. "What happens in my family is my concern," he said firmly. "I've brought you here because I believe in transparency, in handling difficult matters before the community. Thomas has made choices I don't approve of, but he's standing here taking responsibility like a man. That's more than can be said for many young people these days. This ceremony is done. The marriages are acknowledged. Now we all return to our affairs." It was a dismissal, clear and final. Slowly, the crowd began to disperse, though knots of people remained to argue, to speculate, to process what they'd witnessed. Thomas helped the women down from the platform, acutely aware that everything had changed and nothing had changed. They were married in the eyes of 400 witnesses, but still enslaved in the eyes of the law. We're approaching the halfway point of this investigation, and if you're still with me, I want to thank you. This story gets darker from here, more complex, and ultimately more tragic than you might expect. Make sure you're subscribed to Whispers of Mystery so you don't miss the conclusion of this case or the other hidden histories we're working to uncover. Hit that subscribe button now and let's continue. The return to Hollow Crest should have been a relief, but instead it marked the beginning of a different kind of nightmare. Abraham's grand gesture had indeed controlled the immediate narrative, but it had also created a set of consequences he hadn't fully anticipated. The first problem emerged within days of the ceremony. Abraham had intended the public marriage to establish boundaries, to make clear that Thomas's relationships were now proper and therefore contained. But several neighboring planters saw it differently. If enslaved women could be publicly married to their owner's son, what did that mean for the status of any enslaved person? The ceremony had inadvertently suggested that enslaved people could enter contracts, could make choices that carried social weight, could exist as parties to agreements rather than as mere property. A delegation arrived at Hollow Crest on Tuesday, led by Harrison Caldwell and 2 other major landowners. They met with Abraham in his study, and their message was blunt. The ceremony had been a mistake that was causing unrest on their own plantations. Enslaved people were asking questions, wondering if they too could have their relationships recognized, if their families might be protected from separation. The social order required clear boundaries, and Abraham had blurred them dangerously. Abraham tried to explain his reasoning, but Caldwell cut him off. "You've opened a door, Sutherland, and now every one of us will have to deal with what walks through it." The meeting ended with barely concealed hostility, and Abraham realized his calculation had been flawed. He'd solved one problem while creating several others. Meanwhile, in the main house, Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary were discovering the reality of their new status. Abraham had moved them into the guest wing permanently, insisted they take meals with the family, and forbidden them from performing manual labor. On the surface, this seemed like elevation, but it was really isolation. The other enslaved people at Hollow Crest didn't know how to treat them. They were still slaves, but they'd been married to the master's son in front of the entire county. were they to be respected, resented? The resulting tension poisoned the atmosphere. Worse, white society had effectively shunned them. Women who might have visited Hollow Crest to pay social calls now avoided it. Thomas and his 3 wives existed in a social void, acknowledged but not accepted, visible but not seen. Thomas spent his days trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, teaching Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary more advanced reading, discussing with them his still, vague plans for escape to the north. But the plans felt increasingly hopeless. They had no money. Abraham controlled all finances tightly. They had no connections outside Virginia, and now, after the public ceremony, they were under constant observation. Abraham had assigned Peter to essentially guard them, ostensibly for their protection, but really to prevent any attempt at running. Then, in early August, something happened that would crack open the careful stability Abraham had tried to impose. Mary went into labor 3 weeks early, her body racked with complications from the stress of the previous weeks. The birth was difficult, attended by an enslaved midwife named Ruth, who delivered dozens of babies at Hollow Crest. For 12 hours, Mary struggled while Thomas paced outside the room, listening to her screams and feeling utterly powerless. Sarah and Rebecca stayed with her, holding her hands, whispering encouragement. The child, a girl Mary named Elizabeth, survived, but Mary didn't. She died an hour after the birth, her body simply giving out after too much trauma, too much strain. Ruth said later it was exhaustion as much as any physical complication, that Mary's spirit had been fighting battles her body couldn't sustain. Thomas held Mary's cooling hand and wept like a child while Abraham stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. The death changed something fundamental. This wasn't abstract anymore, wasn't about property or social standing or family legacy. A 20-year-old woman had died, leaving behind a newborn daughter. And she died because Thomas had loved her, and Abraham had made them all perform in a public spectacle. The funeral was small, held in the enslaved people's cemetery at the edge of Hollow Crest's property. Reverend Talbot came at Thomas's insistence, though Abraham opposed it. The minister said brief words over Mary's grave, and Thomas stood between Sarah and Rebecca, holding baby Elizabeth, understanding for the first time the full weight of what his fantasy of love and family had cost. That night Thomas went to his father's study. He didn't knock, just walked in and found Abraham sitting at his desk, reviewing accounts as though nothing had happened. "This is your fault," Thomas said, his voice low and controlled. "Your ceremony killed her." Abraham looked up, his expression tired. "The ceremony didn't kill her. Childbirth killed her. It happens. It's tragic, but it happens." "You paraded her like an animal. You forced her to stand in front of hundreds of people while pregnant, made her an object of mockery. I made her visible." Abraham's voice rose suddenly. "Before that ceremony, she was nothing, no one. At least I gave her recognition, gave her child a father who acknowledges her. Don't you dare blame me for trying to salvage your disaster." They stared at each other across the desk, and Thomas saw clearly that his father would never understand, could never see these women as fully human. The ceremony, for all its apparent acknowledgement, had been just another form of ownership, another way of controlling property. "I'm leaving," Thomas said quietly. "I'm taking Sarah, Rebecca, and the children, and we're going north." Abraham's laugh was bitter. "With what money? What plan? You can't even get to Richmond without being stopped." "They're my property, Thomas, legally mine. Try to take them, and I'll have the sheriff bring them back before you reach the county line." It was true, and Thomas knew it. The marriage certificates Abraham had created were meaningless outside the specific context of that ceremony. They didn't grant freedom, didn't change legal ownership, didn't provide any protection at all. They were theatre, nothing more. Thomas left the study without another word and returned to the room he now shared with Sarah and Rebecca. He found them sitting together, Rebecca nursing Elizabeth while Sarah held young Samuel. They looked up at him with eyes that held no illusions about their situation. "We're trapped," Sarah said softly. "It wasn't a question." Thomas nodded. "But I'll find a way. I promise I'll find a way." What came next unfolded over several months, a slow escalation that would ultimately force a confrontation none of them anticipated. In September, Abraham received a letter from a cotton planter in Alabama, a man named Charles Weatherby, who'd heard about the Chesterfield ceremony through the network of correspondence that connected slaveholders across the South. Weatherby's letter was polite but pointed. He was interested in purchasing Rebecca and her daughter Grace, along with Sarah and Samuel if they could be induced to come as well. He'd pay above market value, understanding that the situation at Hollow Crest was delicate. Abraham didn't tell Thomas about the letter immediately. Instead, he considered the offer seriously. The ceremony had achieved its goal of preventing immediate scandal, but it had left him with an ongoing problem. As long as Sarah and Rebecca remained at Hollow Crest, they would be sources of tension, reminders of his family's irregular arrangement. Selling them would resolve that, would restore a kind of normalcy. And Weatherby's offer was genuinely generous. When Abraham finally showed Thomas the letter in late September, the confrontation was explosive. Thomas threatened to expose everything, to go public with the exact nature of the ceremony, to destroy what remained of Abraham's reputation. Abraham responded by threatening to separate the children from their mothers, to sell each to different buyers, so Thomas could never find them all again. The standoff revealed the fundamental truth of their situation. Abraham held all the actual power, and Thomas had nothing but emotional leverage that could be crushed at any moment. Sarah, overhearing the argument from the hallway, made a decision. That night she met secretly with Peter, the man Abraham had assigned to watch them. Peter had grown up at Hollow Crest, had known Thomas since they were boys, and the ceremony had affected him in ways he hadn't expected. Watching Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary stand on that platform had made him think differently about his own family, about the woman he lived with, and their children who could be sold away at any time. "Will you help us run?" Sarah asked him directly. Peter considered this for a long time. "Where would you go?" "Ohio. Thomas has a cousin in Cincinnati who's sympathetic to," she hesitated, using the careful language necessary for such conversations, "to people seeking their freedom. If we can reach him, he might help us get to Canada." "Mr. Abraham will come after you. We'll spend whatever it takes. I know, but we have to try." Peter nodded slowly. "I'll help, but we need resources, money, travel papers, connections. Can't just run blind into the night." What followed was a conspiracy more intricate than anything Thomas could have conceived alone. Peter reached out to a network he'd quietly maintained for years, enslaved people and free blacks who helped runaway slaves move north. Sarah began stealing small amounts of cash from household accounts, taking only amounts small enough not to be immediately noticed. Rebecca made contact with a Quaker merchant in Richmond who was known to sympathize with abolitionists, trading sewing work for information about safe routes and sympathetic contacts. Through October and November, they planned while maintaining the appearance of compliance. Thomas played his part by pretending to accept his father's authority, by appearing defeated and resigned. Abraham, believing he'd won, relaxed his vigilance slightly. The planning required extraordinary caution. Every conversation had to appear casual, every meeting coincidental. Sarah developed a system of leaving notes hidden in the main house's library, tucked between pages of books she knew Thomas would consult. Rebecca used her trips to the smokehouse as opportunities to meet with Peter, who would update her on progress with the underground contacts. They communicated in fragments, in half sentences, always aware that discovery would mean not just the end of their escape plans, but likely their sale to the Deep South as punishment. Thomas, meanwhile, had to maintain his facade of resignation while secretly gathering what resources he could. He sold his watch, a graduation gift from his mother, to a merchant in town, claiming he needed cash for a private matter. He liquidated a small trust his maternal grandfather had left him, money Abraham didn't control, withdrawing it in increments small enough not to raise alarm. Every dollar went into a leather pouch Sarah kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in their room. The real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In early December, Joseph Brennan, the younger planter who defended the ceremony back in July, approached Thomas privately after a church service. Brennan's own conscience had been troubled by what he'd witnessed, and he'd been corresponding with Northern abolitionists about the moral implications of slavery. He offered Thomas something precious, forged travel papers identifying Sarah and Rebecca as free women of color, along with $200 in cash. "I can't make this right," Brennan told Thomas, his voice low and urgent. They stood behind the church, ostensibly discussing crop prices while conducting a transaction that could get them both imprisoned. "But I can make it possible. These papers are good, made by a man in Philadelphia who knows his craft. They'll pass inspection unless you're terribly unlucky." Thomas took the documents with trembling hands, understanding that Brennan was risking everything by helping them. "Why are you doing this?" Brennan's expression was pained. "Because I stood on that platform in July and told myself your father was doing something honorable. But I've spent these months thinking about what I really witnessed, a man trying to turn human beings into a solution to his social embarrassment. I can't undo my part in it, but I can help you undo his." The forged papers were remarkable in their attention to detail. They identified Sarah as Sarah Freeman, free woman of color, born in Richmond, Virginia, 1822, and Rebecca as Rebecca Williams, free woman of color, born in Petersburg, Virginia, 1825. Each document included a physical description, a notarized statement of manumission dated several years earlier, and travel permits allowing them to move freely through Virginia and beyond. The forgeries wouldn't withstand deep scrutiny, but for casual inspection by a sheriff or a railroad conductor, they would likely suffice. With Brennan's help, the escape plan crystallized. They would leave during the Christmas season, when travel was common and less suspicious. Peter knew a steamboat captain who could take them to Richmond for a price, and from Richmond they could take trains north, using the forged papers to pass as a white man traveling with his free employees and their children. The captain, a man named Dutch Vera who'd been running the James River route for 15 years, had helped other fugitives, though always for substantial payment. Peter negotiated a price, $40 to get the group to Richmond with no questions asked. The plan had dozens of points where it could fail. A suspicious neighbor might spot them leaving. Abraham might discover their absence sooner than expected. The forged papers might not hold up to inspection. Dutch Vera might betray them for a reward. Any sheriff between Virginia and Ohio might decide to investigate more closely. And even if they reached Canada, there was always the risk of slave catchers crossing the border, of being discovered and dragged back in chains. But staying meant certain separation. Sarah and Rebecca knew that once they were sold to Alabama, they would never see Thomas again, never see each other again, and their children would grow up in bondage with no hope of eventual freedom. As December progressed, the tension at Hollow Crest became almost unbearable. Abraham, meanwhile, had received 2 more letters from Alabama, Weatherby getting impatient about the purchase, raising his offer to an amount that Abraham found hard to refuse. The final offer was $3,000 for Sarah and Samuel, $500 for Rebecca and Grace. It was well above market value, reflecting both the women's skills and Weatherby's eagerness to close the deal. Abraham decided he would conclude the sale in early January, would tell Thomas after it was done, would deal with his son's rage and grief, and ultimately break him to his will. Abraham wrote back to Weatherby accepting the offer and inviting him to visit Hollow Crest during the Christmas season to inspect his purchase and finalize the paperwork. The letter was sent on December 15th, and Weatherby's response came within a week. He would arrive on December 23rd and expected to complete the transaction by Christmas Day, taking his new property back to Alabama before the new year. Everything came to a head on December 23rd, 1847. Abraham had invited Weatherby to visit Hollow Crest to inspect the property he intended to purchase. The Alabama planter arrived on Tuesday morning with his business agent, and Abraham gave them a tour of the plantation, discussing productivity, metrics, and health records with the detached professionalism of a livestock dealer. Weatherby was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a florid face and a booming voice that carried across Hollow Crest's grounds. His agent, a thin, sharp-eyed man named Crockett, took detailed notes, examining Sarah and Rebecca from a distance as they worked in the main house. Abraham planned to formally introduce Weatherby to Sarah and Rebecca that afternoon, to let the Alabama planter confirm that they matched his requirements and expectations. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the main house's drawing room. Thomas learned about the visit when he saw the strangers walking the grounds with his father. Peter came to him with urgent whispers. "They're here to buy them. Your father's selling. I heard Mr. Abraham talking with that heavy man about transport arrangements to Alabama." The realization hit Thomas like a physical blow. After everything, the ceremony, Mary's death, the months of tense coexistence, his father was going to do exactly what he'd threatened. Sarah and Rebecca would be torn away, sent to Alabama, where Thomas would never see them again, where any possibility of eventual freedom would die in the brutal cotton fields of the Deep South. Thomas found Sarah in the kitchen house, ostensibly supervising the preparation of dinner for Abraham's guests. She looked at him and immediately understood. "When?" she asked quietly. "He's introducing you to the buyer at 2 o'clock. The sale will be finalized tomorrow or the next day." Sarah's hands tightened on the edge of the table. "Then we leave tonight. No more waiting, no more planning. Whatever we have, it's enough." Thomas wanted to argue that they needed more time, more preparation. But he knew she was right. In 24 hours, Sarah and Rebecca might be in chains being transported to Alabama. Any delay was suicide. He found Rebecca in the nursery, caring for the 3 children. When he told her, she simply nodded. "I've been ready since October. We all have." At 1:30, Thomas went to his father's study, where Abraham was preparing documents for the sale. Bills of sale, transfer certificates, health attestations, all the bureaucratic machinery that turned human beings into commodities. Their confrontation was brief but definitive. "You can't do this," Thomas said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "Those marriages were public. You made them public. 400 people watched. Those marriages are legal fictions." Abraham interrupted coldly, not even looking up from his papers. "Useful theatre. The women are my property, and I'll dispose of them as I see fit. I've indulged your attachment for nearly 6 months, but that indulgence ends now. Weatherby is a good man who will treat them well, and they'll be more useful on his cotton operation than they are here causing disruption. They're my wives. You stood there and watched me vow to care for them. I watched you participate in a ceremony designed to prevent scandal. It succeeded in that purpose, but those vows have no legal standing, and you know it. This conversation is pointless, Thomas. Weatherby signs the papers tomorrow morning. The women and children leave on Friday. That's final." Thomas felt something break inside him, some last connection to the man who'd raised him. "Then you never meant any of it. The ceremony, the acknowledgement, the certificates. It was all just another form of control." Abraham finally looked up, his eyes cold and certain. "Everything is control, son. That's the lesson you've failed to learn. I control this plantation. I control the people on it, and yes, I control you, or I will, once you've learned that your romantic notions have no place in the real world. This will hurt for a while, but you'll survive it. Always do. And the children, Samuel and Grace, you're going to separate them from their mothers, send them into cotton slavery before they're old enough to remember anything else. They're young, they'll adapt. Weatherby assures me he doesn't separate children from their mothers until they're at least 10. That's more consideration than many give. The casual cruelty of it, the calm calculation, made Thomas understand that no argument, no appeal to conscience or humanity, would change his father's mind. Abraham had made his decision based on pragmatic considerations: profit, social order, control. The ceremony in July had been a tactical move in a larger strategy, nothing more. Thomas walked out of the study and found Sarah, Rebecca, and Peter waiting for him in the hallway. They'd been listening, understanding from the tone, if not the exact words, that time had run out. "We leave tonight," Thomas said, his voice steady now, emptied of everything except determination, now, before he can stop us. The afternoon dissolved into careful chaos. While Abraham entertained Weatherby and Crockett in the main house, showing them plantation records and discussing the terms of transport to Alabama, Thomas and the others executed the final stage of their plan with desperate precision. Peter brought the wagon around to the back of the property, loading it with supplies they'd been accumulating for weeks: food, blankets, a change of clothes for each person, the leather pouch with their saved money, the forged papers Brennan had provided. Sarah and Rebecca dressed the children warmly, multiple layers against the December cold. Thomas packed his single bag with essentials, including the marriage certificates Abraham had created. He took them not because they had legal value, but because they were proof that what had happened in Courthouse Square was real, was witnessed, could not be completely erased. The hardest moment came when Sarah had to say goodbye to Ruth, the midwife who'd delivered all 3 children and who'd become something like a mother to her. They met briefly in the kitchen house, and Ruth held Sarah's hands tightly. "You're doing right," Ruth whispered. "Running is dangerous, but staying is death. You take care of those babies, and you remember you're stronger than anything they can do to you." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. And then she was gone, moving quickly toward the wagon where the others waited. They left Hollow Crest at 7:30, just after full dark, driving the wagon through the back fields toward a road that would take them to Richmond. Peter guided them, using his knowledge of the county's back roads to avoid main thoroughfares where they might be spotted. The night was bitterly cold, the temperature dropping toward freezing, and thin clouds obscured the moon, providing cover but making navigation treacherous. Samuel, the 2-year-old, kept asking where they were going, his voice carrying in the still air. Sarah held him close, whispering reassurances, while her heart hammered with fear that someone would hear. Baby Grace slept in Rebecca's arms, mercifully quiet. Elizabeth, Mary's daughter, was still too young to understand anything except that the adults around her were tense and frightened. They made good time through the back country, Peter pushing the horses as fast as he dared without risking injury to the animals or drawing attention. Every sound made them freeze: a dog barking in the distance, the creak of another wagon somewhere in the darkness, the hoot of an owl that might or might not be a human signal. The forged papers were hidden in Thomas's coat, but they all knew that papers wouldn't help if they were caught actually running, if Abraham's men found them before they could establish their cover story. Abraham didn't discover they were gone until nearly 9 o'clock, when a servant went to call Thomas for dinner and found his room empty. The initial confusion turned to alarm when Abraham realized Sarah and Rebecca were missing as well, along with the children. His first thought was that they might be in the barn or one of the other outbuildings, but a quick search revealed the truth. The wagon was gone, Peter was gone, and so were several items from the main house. The rage that possessed Abraham in that moment was described by witnesses as terrifying. He swept everything off his desk, smashed a crystal decanter against the wall, and bellowed for his overseer H. Ricks with such fury that people heard him clear across the compound. Weatherby and Crockett watched this display with growing alarm, realizing that their transaction was being disrupted by what was clearly a carefully planned escape. By the time Abraham understood what had happened, that his son had successfully stolen his property and fled, they had a 90-minute head start. Abraham immediately sent riders in pursuit, including H. Ricks and 3 men from neighboring plantations who were skilled trackers. He also dispatched a messenger to the sheriff in Chesterfield, though he was careful in how he described the situation. The official story was about property theft, about 4 valuable slaves who'd been stolen along with a wagon and supplies. He mentioned Thomas only as a possible victim, suggesting his son might have been coerced or kidnapped by the fugitives. The last thing Abraham wanted was for the truth to spread. That Thomas had run away with the 2 women Abraham had publicly married him to, that the ceremony in Courthouse Square had ended with the groom fleeing into the night with his wives. Such a story would make Abraham not just a victim of theft, but a laughingstock, a man whose grand gesture of control had resulted in complete loss of control. But Thomas and the others had those crucial 90 minutes, and Peter's knowledge of the terrain. They reached the James River by 11:30, finding the dock where Dutch Vera kept his small steamboat. Vera was a grizzled man in his 60s who asked no questions, just counted the $40 Peter handed him and gestured for them to board quickly. The boat cast off at midnight, moving upriver toward Richmond through the December darkness. Thomas stood at the railing with Sarah, watching Chesterfield County recede behind them, understanding that he was leaving Virginia forever, leaving everything he'd known except the people beside him. "There's no going back now," Sarah said quietly. "I know. I don't want to go back." They reached Richmond by 3 o'clock in the morning on December 24th, Christmas Eve. Vera docked at a wharf on the city's eastern edge, in an industrial area where late night arrivals wouldn't draw attention. Peter had contacts in Richmond, people who'd help them reach the train station and get tickets north without raising suspicion. The group split up temporarily, with Peter taking the children to a safe house run by a free black family, while Thomas, Sarah, and Rebecca went to a different location to rest and prepare for the next stage. The plan was to reunite at the train station the following evening, Christmas Day, when holiday travel would provide cover for their departure. Those 24 hours in Richmond were among the most terrifying of the entire escape. They were in a city where slave catchers operated openly, where any black person without papers could be questioned, where Abraham's men might arrive at any moment. Sarah and Rebecca stayed hidden in a tiny room above a cooper's shop, while Thomas moved through the city acquiring train tickets and gathering information about routes north. On Christmas afternoon, Abraham's pursuit party reached Richmond. H. Ricks and his men had tracked the wagon to the river, found witnesses who'd seen a group matching their description boarding Vera's boat. They questioned Vera, who claimed to know nothing beyond the fact that he'd taken passengers to Richmond for standard fare. The slave catchers Abraham had hired were more aggressive, threatening Vera with prosecution for aiding fugitives. But the boat captain held firm to his story. Abraham himself arrived in Richmond by Christmas evening, having driven through the night in a fury that exhausted his horses. He went directly to the sheriff's office, offering a substantial reward for information leading to the capture of 4 fugitive slaves, and separately, information about his missing son, Thomas. The reward notice was printed and distributed through Richmond, posted at train stations and hotels, and anywhere travelers might see it. But by then, Thomas and the others were already gone. They'd boarded a northbound train at 6 o'clock Christmas evening, using the forged papers to purchase tickets to Washington. Thomas traveled in a first-class carriage, dressed in his finest clothes, playing the role of a young gentleman traveling north on business. Sarah and Rebecca rode in a separate car designated for free people of color and servants, carrying the children and maintaining the fiction that they were employed by Thomas as nurses and domestics. The journey north was a marathon of sustained terror. At every station, they feared discovery. Every conductor who checked their papers might be the one who noticed an inconsistency. Every passenger who looked at them too long might be someone who'd seen the reward notices. They traveled through Virginia into Maryland, then through Maryland toward Pennsylvania, moving through slave territory where their legal status was most precarious. In Baltimore, they had their closest call. A conductor examined Rebecca's papers more carefully than most, noting the Philadelphia notary mark and asking detailed questions about where she'd lived, who'd freed her, why she was traveling north. Rebecca answered calmly, using the story they'd rehearsed dozens of times, but the conductor remained suspicious. He called for a supervisor, and for 10 agonizing minutes Thomas thought everything was about to collapse. Sarah saved them by producing a letter, another of Brennan's forgeries, supposedly written by a Philadelphia merchant requesting Rebecca's services as a seamstress for his wife. The letter was detailed and convincing, with the merchant's letterhead and a wax seal that looked official enough. The supervisor read it, looked at Rebecca's calm face, and finally nodded. They could continue north. The pursuit continued for weeks. Abraham spent a considerable portion of his fortune hiring professional slave catchers, following leads from Richmond to Washington to Baltimore to Philadelphia. He sent letters to sheriffs and magistrates across 4 states, offered rewards that escalated from $100 to $500 to $1,000. He never publicly acknowledged what he was really pursuing. That would mean admitting that his son had successfully run away with 2 enslaved women Abraham had publicly married him to. Instead, he described it as a property theft combined with concern for his son's safety, suggesting Thomas might be under duress. But the trail went cold in Philadelphia, where the fugitives seemed to vanish completely. In truth, they'd connected with William Still, a black abolitionist who ran one of the most effective stations on the Underground Railroad. Still provided them with shelter for 3 weeks while arranging the next stages of their journey, introducing them to people who could help them reach Canada safely. Thomas, Sarah, and Rebecca spent those weeks in a safe house in Philadelphia's black community, recuperating from the trauma of their escape and preparing for the final push to freedom. During that time, Thomas wrote a detailed account of everything that had happened: the barn, the ceremony, the escape, partly to process his own trauma and partly to create a record that might someday help others understand what they'd survived. Still read Thomas's account and was particularly struck by the description of the courthouse square ceremony. This should be published, he told Thomas. People need to understand the contradictions you've exposed, the way your father tried to have it both ways, to acknowledge your relationships while maintaining ownership. It's the whole system in miniature. But Thomas was too frightened to publish anything that might help Abraham track them. The manuscript went into Still's archives, where it would remain for decades. By February 1848, Abraham had exhausted most leads. His business partners in Virginia began asking questions about the expenses he was incurring, about why he was so obsessed with recovering what amounted to 4 slaves and 3 children. Valuable property, yes, but not worth the time and money he was investing. The truth, which Abraham would never admit, was that this wasn't really about property value. It was about control, about the fact that his son had defied him successfully, that the grand ceremony Abraham had orchestrated had ended in complete humiliation. Abraham was forced to admit defeat, though he never stopped hoping for word that would lead him to Thomas. He returned to Hollow Crest in March 1848, a diminished man whose obsession had damaged his reputation and depleted his resources. The plantation had suffered during his absence, with crops poorly managed and enslaved workers taking advantage of reduced supervision. The sale to Weatherby had fallen through, costing Abraham both the purchase price and Weatherby's goodwill. Worse, the story of Thomas's escape had leaked despite Abraham's efforts to contain it. People knew that something irregular had happened, that the young man who'd been married to 3 enslaved women in that bizarre ceremony had run away with them. The gossip was worse than Abraham had feared, because it made him look not just eccentric but incompetent, unable to control either his son or his property. Abraham lived 3 more years, dying of a stroke in 1851. His final words, according to the house slave who attended him, were, "Find Thomas." Even at the end, he couldn't let go, couldn't accept that he'd lost. Thomas, Sarah, Rebecca, and the children reached Ontario in April of 1848, crossing from Buffalo into Canada with the help of conductors who'd guided hundreds of fugitives to freedom. They settled initially in St. Catharines, a town with a substantial community of formerly enslaved people, before eventually moving to Toronto, where more opportunities existed. There, finally, beyond the reach of Abraham Sutherland's money and power, they tried to build something resembling the life they'd imagined back in that barn at Hollow Crest. It wasn't easy. Thomas worked as a teacher in a school for black children, using his education to serve the community while earning barely enough to support the household. Sarah and Rebecca did sewing, washing, and other domestic work, contributing to the household income while caring for the 3 children. The children grew, learning to read and write in the small schoolhouse Thomas helped establish, growing up free in a way their parents had only dreamed of. But the trauma of what they'd survived marked them all. Thomas suffered from nightmares for years, waking in the middle of the night, convinced he heard his father's voice calling him back, certain that slave catchers were breaking down the door. Sarah developed a nervous habit of checking doors and windows obsessively, never quite believing they were safe, always preparing mentally for the moment when everything would be taken away again. Rebecca, carrying her own grief over Mary's death and the violence of their escape, became intensely protective of all 3 children, rarely letting them out of her sight. The emotional toll was compounded by the practical difficulties of their situation. They were desperately poor, living in 2 rented rooms that barely provided enough space for 6 people. Thomas's education, which had seemed so valuable in Virginia, meant little in Canada, where opportunities for black people were limited, and where his accent and manners marked him as different from both white Canadians and other formerly enslaved people. He felt caught between worlds, belonging nowhere completely. Sarah and Rebecca struggled with their own adjustments. They'd grown up enslaved, had internalized certain survival behaviors that didn't serve them in freedom. The simple act of making decisions about how to spend money, where to live, what work to pursue, required conscious effort. Freedom wasn't the automatic joy they'd imagined. It was a skill they had to learn day by day. The relationship between Thomas, Sarah, and Rebecca also evolved in unexpected ways. In Virginia, the situation had been clear in its illegitimacy. They were slaves. He was their master's son, and their relationships existed in defiance of both law and custom. In Canada, they had to figure out what they actually were to each other. The public marriage ceremony in Courthouse Square haunted them, raising questions about what they'd really agreed to, what